Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on the Transportation and Climate Initiative, otherwise known as TCI, to learn more about how to advocate for clean transportation in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We have a pretty packed schedule for today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. There we go. So my name is Anna Vanderspeck, and I am the Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I'm joined today by my colleague Mal Skovrin. For those of you who are not familiar with Green Energy Consumers, we are a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island with a mission to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low-carbon future. What that means is we run a series of programs and services that help people make smart energy decisions for their lives, and then we take the experience that we gain interacting with consumers and the energy marketplace to inform the advocacy work that we do at the state and local level. Some quick logistics for today's webinar. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but we absolutely encourage your participation and hope that throughout the webinar you'll write in questions on the chat right on the GoToWebinar console. We have left some time at the end of the presentation to go over Q&A, so we definitely want to hear from you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share slides and a recording by email after the webinar. But if you have a friend who you think would particularly benefit from a TCI webinar, we do have a second showing tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. that people are still welcome to sign up for if they're interested. Quickly, just an outline for today's webinar. We've broken this presentation up into 5 parts before we get to Q&A. In the first section, we'll talk about the status quo a little bit to make sure we're all looking at TCI from the same baseline. Then we'll talk about what TCI really is and how it works. We'll talk about equity and how it relates to TCI. We'll talk about the program benefits, and then we'll highlight next steps for advocates both in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So as many of you may know, TCI is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, and it's a regional effort among Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states to cut down greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector through a cap and invest program. We'll talk about what that means exactly in the second section of the presentation, but first we wanted to highlight the damage done by our current transportation system, because many of us just take for granted how we get around, and we've kind of come to assume that the damage that how we get around does to us is baked into the system, and we kind of just overlook it. So we wanted to highlight a couple of those points first before we jump into TCI and how it can help address those problems. So the first part of this that we want to go over is a story that many of you are probably familiar with, which is that transportation is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, both in Massachusetts and Rhode Island specifically, but also nationally. And unlike the electricity sector, where emissions have actually been going down over the past decades because of all the good work that we're doing on efficiency and renewables, transportation emissions are not declining. And it's a really difficult nut to crack because there are so many market actors. In the electricity sector, there's a limited number of generators that you have to work with to clean up the grid. In transportation, there are millions of people making decisions every day about how they get around. So bringing down those emissions is really challenging, but really crucial if we want to meet our greenhouse gas emissions limits goals to fight climate change. A huge part of the problem with our transportation system is that we're, of course, relying on fossil fuels all across the board. And when you burn fossil fuels for transportation, you're not only releasing carbon dioxide, you're also releasing all sorts of pollutants that harm human health. And these are causing real suffering and real damage in our healthcare system. The first thing I want to note is that burning gasoline for transportation is bad, but burning diesel fuel is even worse. So the worst culprits on the public health side of things are those diesel-fueled medium and heavy-duty trucks that we see all around and increasingly with urban delivery. We've taken some maps from the Rhode Island Department of Health to illustrate how this sort of arrow from our reliance on fossil fuels leads directly to health outcomes, and we're taking the city of Providence as an example. So on the left, you can see a map of the diesel particulate matter. Particulate matter is one of those pollutants that comes from burning fossil fuels. It's basically tiny, tiny pieces of stuff that when we breathe them in, lodge in our lungs, get into our bloodstream, and impact not only our lungs, but also hearts and our brains, and can lead to stroke and heart disease and all sorts of terrible things. So diesel particulate matter is really concentrated in those areas that are red on the left map. On the middle map, we're looking at the respiratory hazard index. So we're basically looking at how healthy the air is to breathe. And you can see right away that the red areas in the middle map line up exactly with the red areas on the left map. So the diesel particulate matter is part of the reason why the air quality is so poor in certain parts of Providence and Pawtucket. And then if you take a step further on the right and look at the asthma rate, which is just one of the many health outcomes that we could be taking a look at, you can see that the places with the highest asthma rates line up exactly with the places with poor air quality, which lines up with the places with the diesel particulate matter being the worst. So this is one example of one city, but the same story holds true for cities and towns across our region. In Massachusetts, many of us have been hearing about the city of Chelsea, for example, which has some of the highest COVID rates in Massachusetts. And one of the contributing factors there is air quality. Chelsea is surrounded basically by highways and bears the brunt of all the traffic to and from Logan Airport. As a result, the air quality is really poor, and people's lungs who live there are basically compromised. So they're less able to fight off COVID when it comes. So this is a very real issue that is causing real suffering in real time, and one of the many reasons why we really need to address our transportation system. Unsurprisingly, the burdens of our current transportation system are not distributed equitably across populations. And here we have a map put together by a student, actually at MIT, but with data from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And what this shows is basically on one map, who's responsible for emissions from private vehicles and who's bearing the brunt of poor air quality. So this map is measuring carbon dioxide emissions, and carbon dioxide emissions contribute to climate change, but they do not directly harm human health, but they're correlated with all the terrible things that do. So if you're burning gasoline and releasing carbon dioxide to drive somewhere, you're also releasing particulate matter and contributing to ground level ozone and all sorts of other things that harm people's health. So the story that this map is telling us is that the folks in the red areas have the worst air quality, but the lowest emissions per household. And that is much of Boston and the cities that surround it. Meanwhile, in the suburbs around the city, folks contribute the most to emissions from private vehicles because they're driving everywhere in a lot of SUVs, but they have the best air quality. So this is one map that really tells that story particularly well, that these burdens are not distributed evenly across populations. And then finally, we wanted to highlight some of the economic impacts of our current transportation system. And there are many more that we could list, but the first that we wanted to point out is that our current transportation system leaves a lot of people without access. Access to mobility, but what that really means is access to healthcare or access to jobs with wages that can sustain their family or access to educational opportunities. If you are unable to drive in most of our region, you're effectively stranded. And that causes harm in terms of real people and people's lives, but it's also an economic drain on the region. Secondly, because we rely on fossil fuels for basically all of our transportation, we're sending millions and millions or billions and billions of dollars out of the region. The less that we can rely on fossil fuels, which come to us from places outside of New England, the more those dollars stay in our economies here and can circulate, and that would be an economic benefit. And then finally, congestion. Maybe not top of mind right now because we're in the middle of a pandemic, but many of you likely remember how terrible congestion was before the pandemic, particularly in the greater Boston area. These two images are from the Boston Globe's investigative report on congestion called Seeing Red, which really details the harm that congestion is causing in the greater Boston area. One statistic to pull out there is that the average driver in the greater Boston area spends 80 hours per year in traffic, and that is the equivalent of 2 full work weeks. It's also the equivalent of 80 hours of frustration and discomfort, but in terms of economic impacts, that is a real drain on the region and one of the many reasons why we really need to rethink how we get around.
Thanks, Anna. I'll be taking on this next section about what we can actually do to address the inequitable and problematic status quo that Anna just described. So as Anna said, we have this really multi-headed transportation problem, but at the crux of the problem is that there's really not a great alternative for most folks that are relying on gas-powered cars in Massachusetts and Rhode Island right now. And there's really no ending our addiction to gasoline until there's a way to move people and goods that doesn't pollute and exacerbate the problems that we already have. And so the solution, we believe, is a sustained long-term strategy to give people a better, more affordable, and healthier alternative to driving a gas-powered car. So that's really the crux of what's called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI for short. It is a program that Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. have already signed on to. And the goal is to modernize the transportation system, improve our public health, and combat climate change all in one go, which is really ambitious, but TCI is a really great first step to try and get to that. So just to describe a little bit about how the program works, I like to think of it in these 3 steps. So first of all, each participating state needs to make a commitment to reduce the pollution that comes from vehicles over time. Pretty simple, straightforward. But to make sure we need to stick to that cap, we have to make polluters pay for the carbon-based fuels that they sell in the state. So that allows us not only to track how much pollution is coming from vehicles in a really targeted way, it also allows us to try and get at the root of the problem, which is these gasoline and diesel fuels coming into the state and creating the health and climate outcomes that is unequitable and bad for our health. And then finally, the kind of last step in how the program works is the most important part, in my view. So we use the money that is collected from the importers and suppliers of fuel to solve the problem by investing in alternatives to gas-powered cars. And so the funds generated from the program go directly back into the communities that are suffering from the transportation status quo. And I really want to highlight that that is the most important part of TCI. I think it's really easy to get focused on the cap and how much pollution changes over time. And that's a key part of it, but investments are really going to drive the kinds of change that we need to see in order to modernize our transportation system and make it cleaner and better working for us all. So as I mentioned, 3 states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, have already signed on, plus Washington, D.C. And the pollution cap that is proposed by the program would decline by about 30% from 2022 to 2032. So the program would run for about 10 years. And every year, through the collection of fees from the polluters and importers of fossil fuels, the 4 participating jurisdictions would collect about $300 million annually for the investments that they need in clean transportation. So I'll talk a little bit about what that $300 million can get us in just a couple of slides. But the point is that it can be used for a variety of good things that lots of advocates have been wanting for a long time, including better transit, electric vehicles, and walking and biking, to just name a few areas of investment. But I really want to emphasize the fact that the program is regional. And so the investments that Rhode Island and Massachusetts can make are totally independent of how many other states choose to participate. But the fact that these, typically smaller states are kind of leading the charge on this creates a good model for other states in the region, and also reflects that transportation doesn't end at state borders, especially in a region like New England, where all of our economies are interconnected. And so it's a really important opportunity to not just establish benefits for each state, but also create kind of a trickle effect throughout the region where more states sign on and participate. And even though 4 jurisdictions are currently signed on, we do anticipate more to join on. So on the screen there, you see a timeline of where we're at and where we're going with the TCI program. The final program design was announced in December 2020. So that is what helps us know the fact that the cap is going to decline by 30%. And that gives us a good idea of how much money each individual state will have to play with when they're making their investments. But there is a lot ahead of us in order to make sure that the TCI program can be enacted equitably and effectively in the states that have already signed on. So in the spring, we anticipate the model rule to be released, which is essentially how to administer TCI manual for participating states. And that'll really set the key administrative operations of the program. But what we anticipate really devoting and requiring a lot of energy is the enabling legislation that needs to pass in Rhode Island and Massachusetts in order for them to participate in the program. And so that's going to be a big priority for green energy consumers and many other advocates in this spring. And then after that, we're going to have to collect some baseline data in 2022 to kind of help get the program started. And it wouldn't be until 2023 that we really see the program collecting funds and making investments, at which point it would do that for about 10 years until the program ends in 2032. And I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about how this program will affect drivers, because that's a question that often comes up when people learn about TCI and what it does. And I did mention earlier that polluters are paying for the TCI program, polluters meaning the importers and suppliers of gasoline and diesel fuels. And so each supplier of gasoline and diesel really has an important decision to make. Which is whether they are going to pass the cost on to consumers or eat the cost of the program to have a competitive advantage. This is a decision, again, that is going to have to be made by each individual importer and supplier. And there's good reason to believe that many choose to simply accept the cost of TCI within the marginal cost of doing business. And I'll explain that on the next slide. But there is a potential that some cost is passed to consumers. So just to give a sense of scale, when the TCI program starts, hopefully in 2023, gasoline prices, if the total cost of the program is passed on to consumers from the gasoline and diesel companies, would be about 5 cents per gallon of fuel, or about 45 cents a week for the average driver in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And so 5 cents really isn't that much in the context of how much gasoline prices vary historically. So on the right, you can see the orange line is about how much we would expect to see an increase in fuel prices if the total cost of the program was passed on to consumers. And then on the left, you can see that compared to how much the price of gasoline has varied over the last 20 years. And so you can see 5 cents where the program starts out, and the orange line where it might increase as that cap decreases over time is really well within how much gas prices typically change because of global fluctuations in the oil market. These are prices that we cannot control. It's purely at the whim of the global market and global demands, but we see that it's well within the range of how we might naturally see gas prices fluctuate over time. So it's very unlikely that most consumers even notice that there's any additional cost being passed on to them. And it's also worth noting that people that already use the bus or walk or carpool or do anything but drive by themselves in a gas-powered car will only see benefits from the program because the cost, if passed on to consumers, would only be levied for those that are driving gas-powered cars. So again, it's a very reasonable cost for the scale of benefits that we receive from the program, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But put another way, I do want to emphasize that it's very likely that gasoline and diesel companies simply choose to accept the 5 cents per gallon as the cost of doing business, because 5 cents is the difference between 2 competing gas stations on the same road. And this is quite literally true. This data on the screen there is from February 3rd. And so you can see 2 competing gas stations on the same road in the same town in Rhode Island, and there was a 7-cent difference between what those 2 gas stations were offering. So 5 cents could be a competitive advantage for one gasoline company that chooses to not pass that on to consumers in order to encourage more people to shop at them. It's well within the marginal cost of doing business, and so it's very likely that consumers never see the cost of TCI at all and really only see the benefits.
So I'll take back the invisible mic here and talk a little bit about equity. In the first portion of the presentation, we talked about the inequities that are inherent in the status quo, but we do want to take a moment to explicitly address how TCI will address those inequities moving forward. So unsurprisingly, the advocates that have been working on TCI, and I'm talking about advocates both in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and all across the New England and Mid-Atlantic states that have been participating in the program thus far, everybody basically agrees that our current system is not good. It's not serving people well. It's levying burdens on people who are contributing to the problem the least. And everybody who's thinking about TCI really wants more of the good things. We want more biking, we want more walking, we want more public transit, and we want more electrified transportation in general. With that said, there is a wide range of opinions on TCI, and we did want to take a moment to acknowledge that people have different levels of feelings about TCI, and that's true even among environmental justice organizations. So some people are concerned about how TCI will put a price on fuel, or on emissions rather. Some are opposed to market-based programs just fundamentally, and a cap and invest program is a market-based program. Some are worried that the revenue that the program will generate won't be dispersed in a way that really targets people who need it the most first. And some feel that the process up until now has not been inclusive enough. So we did want to take a moment to acknowledge those concerns because they're real and they are important. We support TCI because we know that as advocates within each of our states, we can work year after year after year to make sure that the revenue that TCI will generate is spent in a way that both addresses the historical harms of our transportation system and really brings down greenhouse gas emissions. As we saw in the status quo section, there's really a lot of work to be done, and that work requires investment. And TCI will provide a dedicated stream of investment for us to start doing this work. So that's why we support TCI. No single policy is perfect, but we think that TCI is a really powerful tool in the toolbox to start righting some of these historical wrongs. Historical and present wrongs, I should say. So as I said, advocates have been thinking about TCI and equity for a really long time. And over the past couple of years in particular, there was a really concerted push to make sure that whatever documents and frameworks in the TCI program come out, that they really start to address these issues. So in the final memorandum of understanding that came out in December and that those 4 jurisdictions have signed so far, there are 4 explicit provisions baked in that speak to the equity issues. So the first is that any jurisdiction that signs on to TCI is agreeing to invest a minimum of 35% of the proceeds into overburdened and underserved communities. They're also agreeing to establish and support equity advisory bodies where a majority of members will actually be representatives of those overburdened and underserved communities that the program is trying to serve. These bodies will be responsible for setting definitions and metrics and figuring out how to measure progress and how to direct investments from the TCI program. Then the jurisdictions are also agreeing to ongoing and annual reviewing and reporting, including, and this is important, air quality monitoring in hotspot communities. So places where public health is really suffering because of the air quality, will actually start measuring what the air quality is and seeing what the change is over time. And then finally, the fourth provision is an agreement among the jurisdictions that TCI really is just one tool in the toolbox, but all of the states are agreeing to pursue complementary policies to achieve additional emissions reductions. So there's kind of two ways of looking at these provisions. One is they're basically guardrails. On the regional level, the states have agreed that we're all going to do this, and it sets everybody kind of going in the right direction. But as advocates, we can use these provisions to basically hold our states' feet to the fire and make sure that they're really following through on these 4 points and then pushing them beyond. So they're a good start, but they're a tool that we can use to push for even more. Mal will go over the benefits of TCI in just a moment, but I wanted to pull one of them out specifically in this section, and that is public health. As we'll see shortly, the public health benefits of TCI are expected to be on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they, on the macro scale, definitely outweigh the costs of the program. But when we're thinking about equity, it's really important to think about the distribution of those benefits. And so here we luckily have a project done through the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and a couple of other universities that looked at this question in particular. How will TCI impact public health? And what this study found is that TCI is expected to decrease the disparity between white and non-white populations' exposure to air pollution. So the graph on the right is from the American Lung Association, and it's there to remind us of just how stark that disparity is. TCI cannot close that gap, and it's also important to remember that that gap exists largely because of transportation, but there are lots of other factors influencing why there is that difference between white and non-white populations on the air pollution front. But it is absolutely great news that TCI can start closing that gap, and really what I think a good takeaway from the study is that it's just a clarion call for that fourth equity provision that we just talked about, the complementary policies. TCI can start doing this work, but we really need targeted investments in communities that are particularly suffering under the burden of transportation pollution to start cleaning up the air there and increasing public health. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mel.
Thanks, Anna. As I mentioned, the benefits of TCI, I think, are really the crux of the program. It's how most everyday people are going to be able to interact with the results of the program. And it's kind of reflective of the way that most people think about transportation, which is how they're able to get around, what options they have, and the investments that are made in their community. And of the potential opportunities that TCI funding could support, there are lots of worthwhile, impactful investments on the table. In particular, Green Energy Consumers is excited about improving and electrifying transit service. Particularly, it's a win-win. When transit is well funded, it attracts new riders, which helps eliminate pollution from vehicles. But considering the fact that most existing folks that are dependent on transit tend to be lower income and not be able to afford another way to get around, focusing on transit also improves the mobility of everyone who already relies on the system. So it's a great win-win there. But there is also potential opportunity to support active mobility. So that includes infrastructure to make it safer and easier to bike and walk more places. That's not only good for the climate, but good for our public health as well. As good as it is to clean up the air and kind of improve the health impacts of the ways that we get around walking and biking have kind of additional health benefits they heap onto the system. And so that could be really great for lots of communities that are particularly dense. And then finally, we want to be able to support the electrification of vehicles as well. So for people that can switch to taking the bus or choose to walk or bike instead, that's great. But ultimately, we know that there's no way to get to net zero by 2050 and to really address the climate crisis without electrifying the vehicles that are on the road. And so altogether, in any combination of these investments, the participating states could see as much as $264 million in health benefits over the 10 years that the program is running. And I want to emphasize that the decisions for how we should be spending the TCI money have not been made at all. Everything is on the table, and for right now, we're really just trying to focus on getting the program in motion so that we're able to make the kinds of spending decisions that we need to make in order to address the climate crisis and address our public health problems. Spending decisions will have to be made every year, and our goal is for communities, especially those overburdened by the existing system, to have a large voice in what is done. And as I said, there are lots of right ways to do this. So on the screen here, I have 3 example portfolios proposed by the Rhode Island Mobility Innovation Working Group that just kind of give a sense of how we should break down funding and, you know, what kinds of things the states should prioritize. The first pie chart focus on electrifying vehicles is really great for the climate. It does a lot to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the vehicles because of how much better electrification and electric vehicles are than gas and diesel powered vehicles. So there's huge benefit there. The second portfolio, which has an emphasis on transit and walking and biking, has a pretty good impact on greenhouse gas emissions as well. But it also has really high health benefits because of how much better it is to support walking and biking and encouraging people to use those modes in order to support better cardiovascular health. But more than likely, we're going to see some blended portfolio where there's a little bit of everything. And ultimately, the money that TCI provides annually is not enough to make the kinds of transformative change that we need in order to address the problems that Anna described earlier in the presentation. Rhode Island will receive about $20 million annually, and Massachusetts, because it's larger and has more drivers, will receive about $160 million annually. But clean transportation is going to need much more investment over the long term in order to see the kind of transformative change we need. So while TCI is a great start and a great tool in the toolbox to have, it's really a first step to try and continue to carry on this path and create a new paradigm for how these kinds of transportation decisions are made. As a matter of scale, and as an example, Rhode Island recently released a transit master plan to improve public transit over the next 10 or 15 years. And the plan would cost about $90 million annually to come to fruition. But Rhode Island is only seeing about $20 million a year from TCI. So we're going to need more investment. We're going to need more policies that address the crux of the public health issue and the climate crisis. But without TCI, there's really no stepping stone to get to that transformative change. And we do see an opportunity for TCI to kind of leverage the existing energy from the Biden administration in order to kind of make those investments. Because TCI is a regional program, we think it'll really catch the attention of the new Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who is supporting a lot of the transformative change that TCI can lead to as well.
Mal. So we will now quickly transition to what advocates in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island can do about TCI, and then we will get to the Q&A because there's a lot of good questions coming in. So first, if you are in Massachusetts, there are a couple of things you can do. So the first thing I should mention is that Governor Baker has authority under the Global Warming Solutions Act to implement TCI. So on the advocacy front in Massachusetts, a lot of the work will be administrative rather than legislative, although not solely. There is one immediate step that you can take, which is to comment on the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan. So the Baker administration released this document at the end of December, and it's basically the plan for the next 10 years about how we're going to reduce transportation emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in transportation, buildings, electricity supply, and what strategies we're going to rely on to do that. In the transportation section, TCI is mentioned as the first strategy, and to his credit, Governor Baker has been really out front on this policy and the benefits that it can bring. There are a couple of things, though, that we would have liked to see in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan that we will be submitting in our own comments, which we will make public today if you want to read them. But basically on TCI, there's 3 points. The first is that the administration has said that there will be a public process to help determine how TCI revenue will be spent and how the program will be implemented, but we don't yet have details on what that public process will look like. So our first ask in our comments on this portion was tell us what the process is and get the ball rolling. The second part is that we think the administration should get moving as quickly as possible on these equity advisory bodies. As Mal mentioned in the timeline, TCI proper doesn't start until 2022 and revenue doesn't start coming in until 2023, but we don't think we should wait until 2023 to form these bodies. There's really important work that we could be doing now to lay the groundwork for a more successful and equitable TCI. So our second point is form those bodies ASAP. And then our third point speaks a little bit to our main takeaway on the entire transportation section in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which was that there was not enough support for public transit. In general, the plan, it felt like it took public transit for granted, and we wanted to explicitly see support for transit and expanding transit. So our third point would be in the final draft of this Clean Energy and Climate Plan, the administration needs to put much more of an emphasis on supporting transit, and TCI is one way to help make that happen, particularly if we want to electrify public transit as we should. So comments for the interim Clean Energy and Climate Plan are due by March 22nd, so that is your immediate to-do. There are 2 more to-dos in the short term, but with kind of nebulous timescales. The first is that there will be this public process on TCI, and we hope you are ready and waiting to engage on that once it gets started. We will definitely keep you posted as to when that happens and what form it takes. So stay tuned to your email and our blog to know when that happens. And then the second is that there are a group of advocates and legislators in Massachusetts that are working on a bill to direct the administration on how to spend revenue from the TCI program. So that will be coming out in the coming weeks as well, and there will definitely be opportunities to engage there. And same thing, stay tuned, check out our blog and our emails. We'll make sure to keep you informed on when those opportunities are.
And I can talk a little bit about Rhode Island. So if you've been following Rhode Island politics or the legislative session at all, you know that there has been a bit of a shakeup in terms of leadership. Governor Raimondo, a TCI champion, has been tapped to go to Washington, D.C. to serve as Commerce Secretary. And so Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee will be taking on her position in the near future. And so the next step for advocates is really to try and encourage from the legislative end support for TCI. We're still trying to figure out exactly where Dan McKee stands on TCI, and he has said some really great things about the importance of creating jobs and the economic benefits of acting swiftly and decisively on the climate crisis. And so our hope and expectation is that Dan McKee continues to be a climate champion and champion for TCI in Rhode Island. But the main next step for folks is to voice support for TCI with your state senators and representatives. Because the legislation has not yet been introduced, we're just trying to get the buzz up and communicate to legislators that people want this, people support this, and there's interest to make this happen in Rhode Island, despite a really rocky and difficult time in the State House with it meeting virtually and whatnot. So if you're interested in reaching out to your legislators, there's going to be draft language and instructions on how to reach out to them via email. Green energy consumers will be taking a leading role in encouraging support for TCI, both in the House and Senate, as well as in the executive branch. So we're really excited to move that forward. But we also have a lot of support from coalitions that are ready to act on climate in Rhode Island, including community partners that primarily work with overburdened and underserved communities like the Latino Policy Institute and George Wiley Center. So as we move forward, we're really definitely going to be listening to what they have to say about the program and how we can make sure that it is as strong and impactful for those folks as possible. And with that, I think it's time for Q&A.
So as Mal, you were just speaking, I was looking at the Q&A, and I think I'll jump in on a couple of questions that have been coming in. The top one that I want to address, because I think it's really important and it's something that we've been thinking a lot about, is coming back to the equity issue. So the question is, and I'll kind of paraphrase it, is like, what is the situation with environmental justice organizations? How many support? How do they feel? I'll answer this, I think, by giving a little bit more context of how the work has been happening on TCI in Massachusetts, and then I'll let Mal speak a little bit to Rhode Island. So in Massachusetts, there is a group of advocates that have been working on TCI for a long time, and it's called the Massachusetts TCI Advocates Table, and it's basically a lot of different organizations coming together to help shape this policy. Within that table, there is a smaller group that is specifically dedicated to equity and how to invest the revenue coming from TCI in a way that really targets those folks who need it most. So there are basically a group of advocates who, despite the fact that they don't all have the exact same position on TCI, and we're ranging the gamut from opposing to supporting to somewhere in between, everybody's working together to find ways to shape the policy to get the best possible outcome. So there are EJ groups on that table, there are traditional, like, bigger environmental organizations at that table, but everybody's working together to make sure that we really see some of these key priorities come through, and that work has been going on and will continue to go on, and I think it's a good reason to have hope that TCI will actually lead to some good results for us, which Mal just talked about. But Mal, do you want to talk a little bit more about the work in Rhode Island?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a major point of criticism from a lot of folks that are primarily working in environmental justice communities is that TCI doesn't do enough, which is totally true, right? Like, the scale of the problem that we are facing with the transportation component of the climate crisis is massive. And there's no single policy that anyone could come up with that would address every single issue that is caused by gasoline and diesel vehicles. But TCI is a really good first step because of that investment piece. And so in particular in Rhode Island, I think it's going to be important to make sure that the communities that have been historically ignored by transportation decisions have a seat at the table when deciding how the investments will be affecting their communities. So there's already a good model for this. The Providence Climate Justice Plan did a great job in modeling how government can successfully work on community engagement to make sure that the changes that are made are reflective of what the community wants. And so, regardless of your belief of how cap and trade or cap and invest programs are structured, I think it's the opportunity to change the paradigm in which these kinds of planning decisions are made is really valuable, and TCI gives us a good tool to attack that problem.
I will jump right into some more questions, Mal. I hope that's okay. There's a lot coming in, so we have to parse through them. One quick question that I'll respond to is, why does the program end in 2032? What happens then? And I think the short answer is 10 years is a nice time frame to try and corral all of these different states into agreeing on one thing. You can't have it be too long. But I think the hope is that once TCI gets implemented and it starts working, and states can see the benefits and see how the systems work, that they would continue working together to extend it or adjust it as needed. So that's the only reason that it currently ends in 2032. There's one question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mal.
Oh, thanks. I was just going to say there was a question kind of piggybacking off of that as to why fuels from airplanes and aviation wasn't included. And it's really getting at the fact that we're trying to, support transportation alternatives. And there's not a super great alternative for aviation fuel at this time. But we pretty much know how to decarbonize the transportation sector. Investment in electric vehicles, transit, and biking and walking. And we just need the funding to do it. So TCI kind of is a very practical approach for that 10-year period.
There's another question about what metrics are being used to track the equity impacts of TCI. We talked a lot about air pollution, but there's definitely other aspects that need to be taken into account. I think this right now is an open question. So again, those equity advisory bodies that I talked about, one of their key roles will be determining exactly how we want to track that. There's some really great research that has come out recently. One study out of Tufts University with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and one out of Salem State University with the Conservation Law Foundation, both of which were basically looking at key things like access to transit, health outcomes, language, income, air pollution levels, all of those things, to make a map of Massachusetts so that we can start to isolate which communities exactly should be targeted first and how. That is research that is going into both the legislation that will probably be filed soon about how the state should think about that, but also those are resources that will be at the disposal of those equity advisory bodies and the administrators at the state level to help figure that out. So I think that is a question that is still open and being worked on, but I think everybody recognizes that there's more to take into account than just air pollution levels. Mal, I'm wondering if you can speak to the question about the time frame for Rhode Island legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the question that I was just looking at. So as I mentioned, TCI bill has not yet been introduced, though one is in the works. And so right now we're working on trying to educate legislators about the benefits of TCI and why it's a good program that they should get behind. It is quite a crowded field in terms of climate and environment legislation in Rhode Island this year, which is a great thing because, as I mentioned, there are lots of different things that we need to do in order to address the issues at hand. And so TCI is just one of them. But once the bill is introduced, then the goal will really be to try and move the bill out of committee and get it passed along with the, dozens of other bills on the table. Because of the uncertainty regarding, how the legislature is meeting, they got about a month late start because of the hybrid in-person online system. So it's still unclear exactly how long the legislative session will even last this year. But for right now, we're asking folks to reach out, voice their support, and once the bill is introduced and starts moving, green energy consumers will absolutely let you all know about how to engage with the process beyond that.
Still have a couple of minutes, so I'll just keep going through these questions. One question is, will green energy consumers advocate for incentives to make EVs affordable to lower income residents, such as allowing rebates for used EVs? And the answer is yes, and we already have been. So this has been one of our priorities for a long time, to make the current More EV program, which is our state's incentive for electric vehicle purchase, basically be accessible to more people. So we've been advocating that it is extended to used vehicles, but also that it becomes a point of sale rebate, so that you don't have to put money out and then be reimbursed by the state later, but that it's just right there at the point of sale. There is a Zero Emission Vehicle Commission that meets quarterly with the state to talk about changes that should be made or how the More EV program is going, and we've voiced our support for those measures in the past. We've also worked on things like expanding the More EV program to commercial fleets, which was a recommendation we made that the state did actually put in place. So now if you are a business and you want to get an EV, you can apply for the More EV rebate for your business. And right now, the ZEV Commission and the state are considering expanding the More EV rebate to medium and heavy duty trucks, in light of the fact that they really are the worst polluters on the public health front. So there are exciting changes actually coming on the More EV front that will hopefully make it more accessible and bring the benefits to more folks. But there's always more to be done. But that's definitely been one of our priorities. Mal, do you want to take one of the many questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a question from Fred about whether each state has absolute discretion over how TCI income is invested, and whether they could just use it to reduce their budget deficit. So that has been a major point of advocacy for green energy consumers and the several other organizations that have been at the negotiating table for figuring out how TCI works. And that is a major concern, because we absolutely don't want TCI funding to be used to expand highways or just fill other budget holes within the transportation system. And so the legislation that is going to be proposed should make it pretty explicit what the funding can and cannot be used for. And the exact language of that, is pretty policy wonky and maybe not the best thing to chat about here, but suffice it to say, that is definitely a major point of concern, and we're going to make sure that the money can't be used for things other than what it's intended for. And it's also worth noting that there is already a model of a system that works pretty well, called RGGI. It's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it's essentially the same structure of program, but geared at the electricity sector. So this is already a type of program that the states that are participating have experience in, and it's kind of been working more behind the scenes to make sure that the states like Rhode Island and Massachusetts continue to invest in energy efficiency and other low-cost ways to reduce emissions from electricity. But there is some experience with that, and so we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. But that is a good question.
I'll take another, because I neglected to explain this when I was talking about steps for Massachusetts advocates. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan, the way that you comment on it is by submitting comments through a form online. We will send out in the follow-up email after our 2 TCI webinars, we'll send out an email that shows you exactly how to do that, and we'll link to our own comments, which you can use as a model for your own. So thank you for asking that question, because I did not mention it on that slide, but it's all easy to do online, and you can do it then. We have just a couple more minutes, so Mal, do you have a question that you want to wrap us up with, or I'm also happy to just close this out with our last couple slides?
I have a really great question that just came in from Tom, which is, who are the opponents of TCI and what are their vested interests that cause them to oppose it? And I think this is a really good question because I think it reinforces the need to make sure that TCI is as equitable as possible. So because of the possibility that some small costs could be passed on to consumers, we absolutely want to make sure that the benefits of the program are visible and seen by the many. And so because gasoline-powered cars is the dominant way that most people get around, it can be really scary to kind of envision making the changes that we need in order to address the health issues that we have, in order to fight the climate crisis, in order to relieve congestion in the Boston metro area. And so I think a lot of opponents of TCI are really focused on that cost burden, which is a great thing to bring to the table. But what I really believe is the best thing about TCI is it gives us the tools to make transportation better and more affordable for folks that otherwise have only had the option to have a gas-powered car, and that's been the only option for the majority of folks. And so to the extent that we can make the investments to create more options for consumers, more options that are better for our health, more options that allow us to, have some choice in whether to take the bus or, get around some other way. I think that's really the key thing to focus on. And while, thinking about underlying cost to consumers is important, we think that the benefits that we get from making these investments far outweigh the small cost that's incurred. So great question, and I'm excited to have that conversation with more folks as more people learn about the program.
With that, I think I'll move to our last two slides, which are obligatory. The first is, if you've enjoyed this webinar and are able to contribute to Green Energy Consumers Alliance in any way, we would of course very much appreciate it, especially in these times. You can, if you go to greenenergyconsumers.org/givenow, you can direct your donations to specific places, or you can just give and let us use it where it's needed. But our organization relies on the generosity and participation of folks like you. So if you are able to, we would be very thankful. And then if you enjoyed this webinar and would like to attend more, we have a whole bunch coming up that you can see at greenenergyconsumers.org/events. We've got webinars on electric vehicles, on solar, and more on policy stuff as well. One we want to call out in particular, because I think anybody who's on this webinar will be interested, is we'll have a webinar on the 25th about phasing out gasoline here and around the world. You might have heard that California has made a point of saying we're going to phase out gas-powered cars by 2035. And lots of countries around the world are doing that too, and Massachusetts and Rhode Island are following suit. So we have a great list of panelists arrayed to talk to us about what that means, and we hope you can make it. But with that, I think it's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us today, and have a great rest of your day.